Before you drift off into a serene dream about gladiators, let us know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Are you nestled in a cozy bed in Britain? Maybe you're on the verge of a nap in New Zealand. Drop us a comment. And while you're at it, hit that like button so gently you don't wake anyone up. And subscribe for more super simplified stories that are guaranteed to be anything but boring even when we pretend they are. Alright, let's set the stage. We're talking about Rome, the city that gave us concrete, efficient sewage systems, and the idea that the law should apply to everyone even if applying it sometimes meant applying a large, pointy object. The Romans, for all their military might and engineering genius, were fundamentally a people obsessed with two things, order known as ordo, and law use. They believed that a structured, lawful society was the ultimate proof of their civilization's superiority. If you wanted to run an empire that stretched from the sands of Egypt to the rainy fields of Britain, you needed rules. Lots and lots of rules. But Roman law wasn't just about paying your taxes and not running over pedestrians with your chariot. It was a philosophy, a religion, and a political tool all rolled into one. And at the heart of this system was the idea of justice. Now, justice in Rome wasn't always about fairness. It was about vindication and deterrence. When a crime was committed, the social order was disrupted, and the punishment had to be severe enough to re-establish that order and make absolutely sure no one else even thought about trying it. Our journey into Roman gruesomeness begins not with the emperors, but with the very foundation of their legal system, the law of the 12 tables. Drafted around 450 BC, these were the first written laws of Rome, displayed publicly so everyone knew the score. Before this, laws were a secret passed down by the elite, which is basically an invitation for corruption. The 12 tables changed that, providing a framework for everything from property disputes to what you could and couldn't sing at a funeral. But the tables also contained some spectacular punishments. For example, if you were caught stealing crops by night, you were to be offered as a human sacrifice to the agricultural god Ceres. Talk about a tough line on gardening. If you were a fraudulent patron, a wealthy protector to your client, a dependent, the penalty was to be sock air, cursed, and you could be killed by anyone with impunity. Essentially, your life had no legal value. It was the original cancel culture, but with sharp knives. The evolution of Roman law moves from this early, almost primal system into something more formalized, but often no less brutal. As the Republic expanded and became wealthier, the legal system had to adapt. Trials became more complex, involving eloquent orators like Cicero, and the concept of provocatio emerged, the right of a Roman citizen to appeal a death sentence to the people's assembly. This was a crucial safeguard, but it only applied to citizens. If you weren't a citizen, your rights could often be summarized as zero. The core difference between ancient justice and modern justice is this: modern justice focuses on the individual. Roman justice focused on the state and the family. A crime was a failure to uphold the Pax Romana, Roman peace, and often brought shame upon your entire familia. Therefore, the punishment had to cleanse the stain. This is why public humiliation, brutal physical penalties, and the concept of losing face were so central to the Roman judicial process. It wasn't enough to just imprison someone, you had to make an example of them. Imprisonment, by the way, was usually just a holding cell before trial or execution, not a punishment in itself. The Romans thought long-term imprisonment was a waste of perfectly good labor. Now, let's talk about the Roman people's favorite place to dispense justice, the Forum. This was the ultimate public stage. Imagine a bustling marketplace, a political rally, and a court all rolled into one, and everyone is a potential jury member. When a notorious criminal or a captured enemy was executed, it wasn't a quiet affair behind closed doors. It was a spectacle designed to entertain, terrify, and educate the masses all at once. The entire population was meant to leave the Forum with the image of the condemned etched into their minds, a permanent reminder of the consequences of challenging Rome. The state wasn't just punishing, it was performing. The most common form of execution for a Roman citizen before the empire became excessively cruel was decapitation, often by axe, because it was considered the most honorable and quickest way to die. It maintained a shred of dignity, or at least minimized the duration of indignity. But for non-citizens, slaves, and those committing particularly heinous crimes like treason maestas, the Romans got creative, really creative. Let's look at one of the most infamously grueling punishments, crucifixion. This wasn't invented by the Romans, but they certainly perfected its use as a tool of state terror. It wasn't meant to just kill. It was meant to be the ultimate statement about the utter worthlessness of the victim. It was a slow, public, agonizing death, often placed right next to major roads as a warning sign. A crime scene that doubled as an advertisement for Roman power. If you were a rebellious slave or a mutinous foreigner, this was your destiny. It was meant to break the condemned physically and mentally, while simultaneously broadcasting a clear message: do not challenge Rome, your pain is our public service announcement. The Romans also had a truly bizarre set of punishments reserved for crimes that threatened the very fabric of their society and their deeply held, almost superstitious beliefs. Take, for instance, parricide, the murder of one's own parent or close relative. This was seen as a crime so unnatural, so fundamentally offensive to the gods and the Roman familia, that it required a punishment equally unnatural, pona cullae, or the punishment of the sack. The murderer would be sewn into a large leather sack, cullius, along with a selection of live animals: a dog, a snake, a monkey, and a rooster. The sack would then be tossed into the nearest body of water. Imagine the sheer theatrical horror of this. The symbolism was potent. The victim was isolated from all human society. The sack, forced into contact with the animal kingdom, the beasts, and denied the dignity of a proper burial, drowning. It was a deliberate, total annihilation of the individual's social and spiritual identity. The sight, the sounds, the knowledge of the condemned person's final, frantic moments inside that dark, thrashing sack were meant to instill a lifelong terror in anyone who witnessed it. Now, for political enemies, the Romans preferred something swift but equally definitive. During the late Republic and early Empire, when political infighting turned deadly, exile and confiscation of property became the favorite tool. Being forced into exile would sound mild compared to a sack full of animals, but for a Roman senator, losing your property, your political career, and your social status was a civil death. You were still alive, but everything that made you a Roman was stripped away. Your political rivals could watch you live out your final, miserable years, knowing they had utterly crushed you without having to get their hands too bloody. It was a clean, efficient way to remove a threat and absorb their assets, a win-win for the victorious faction. The motivation behind all this gruesomeness wasn't simply sadism. It was control. In a pre-modern society, without police forces capable of patrolling every street corner or high-tech surveillance, the best way to maintain peace was through overwhelming fear. The occasional public spectacle of extreme punishment was a cheap, highly effective way of keeping a vast, diverse, and often unruly populace in line. Every whipping, every crucifixion, every burning was a silent census of power. Rome is in charge, and Rome demands obedience. This established the foundation for Roman rule for centuries, turning the spectacle of justice into a cornerstone of imperial stability. As we transition from the Republic to the Empire, the nature of Roman justice and its application began to change dramatically. Power became concentrated in the hands of a single man, the emperor, and the law became, in many ways, an extension of his personal will. This is where justice gets truly bizarre, and the key figures in this gruesome opera start taking center stage. The key figure in the transformation of law into a weapon was the Emperor Augustus. He was the master of spin. While he restored order after the chaos of the civil wars, He also centralized judicial power. He created new laws, but more importantly, he controlled who enforced them. Under the empire, the Senate's power to hold trials dwindled, and cases of high importance, especially those dealing with treason, were increasingly heard by the emperor himself or his designated officials. This effectively meant that political opposition became a capital offense. But the real architectural genius of terror was arguably Tiberius, Augustus's successor. Tiberius was a paranoid, brilliant, and deeply suspicious ruler who weaponized the law of maestas, or treason, like no one before him. Treason, under the Republic, usually meant actively rebelling against the state. Under Tiberius, treason could mean almost anything that showed disrespect to the emperor. Criticizing his appearance, failing to properly venerate his statues, or even having a dirty coin with his face on it could land you in deep trouble. Tiberius's reign saw the rise of the delatores, or informers. These were professional muckrakers who made a living by accusing others of treason. They were incentivized by the state, often receiving a portion of the condemned person's confiscated property. This created a culture of pervasive fear and suspicion, a social cancer that ate away at the trust between Romans. Imagine knowing that your neighbor, your friend, or even your relative might denounce you to the state just to pocket your possessions. It led to a chilling silence in Roman society, where people were terrified to speak openly about politics or even the weather, lest they accidentally commit a capital offense against the emperor's image. This system of informers and expanded treason laws was a main conflict that defined the early empire. It wasn't a war between armies. It was a psychological war between the ruler and the ruled, fought in the courtrooms and the streets of Rome. Tiberius didn't even have to lift a finger. The fear of being informed on did the job for him. The trials themselves became theatrical bloodbaths, especially those involving senators and members of the elite. These weren't quiet, somber legal proceedings. They were public humiliations designed to destroy the defendant's reputation before the executioner even arrived. The Senate, once the proud ruling body of the Republic, was reduced to a rubber stamp, eagerly condemning its own members to death to prove its loyalty to the emperor. This was the ultimate political tool, using the appearance of due process to commit judicial murder, all in the name of order and use. The typical fate for a high-ranking citizen accused of treason under the early emperors was forced suicide. This was often presented as a merciful option, but it was anything but. The condemned would be given a sharp knife and an order, essentially allowing them to preserve their family's honor and property, sometimes by taking their own life before the official sentence could be carried out. It was a gruesome choice, but the alternative, public execution, complete property confiscation, and the utter ruin of the family name, was often worse. The story of Seneca, the philosopher, forced to commit suicide by Nero, is a famous, tragic example of this chilling practice. The transformation of Roman justice from a tool of the Republic to a terror weapon of the empire reached its baroque, horrifying peak under emperors like Caligula and Nero. If Tiberius was the master of paranoia, Caligula and Nero were the masters of theatrical, public cruelty, mixing the duties of a judge with the appetites of an entertainer. Caligula was famous or infamous for his impulsive, theatrical brutality. He loved public executions, but he insisted on dragging them out. One historian noted that he would command people to be tortured while tasting their death, often stopping the process to prolong the suffering. He was notorious for throwing people to the beasts in the arena, not for a crime, but simply because he found the sight amusing, or because he had a grudge. His arbitrary, godlike use of power meant that no one, no matter how high-ranking, was safe. The law stopped being an impersonal system and became the emperor's personal mood ring. If he was in a bad mood, someone was going to pay for it, often with their life in the most humiliating way possible. This was the point where youth was completely subsumed by imperial whims. Nero, an emperor who fancied himself a poet and an actor, took the theatricalization of justice to new terrifying levels, especially with the emerging Christian community. After the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, Nero, needing a scapegoat, blamed the Christians. The resulting persecutions were not mere executions. They were horrifying public spectacles staged for the entertainment of the populace. According to Roman historian Tacitus, the Christians were not only executed, but used as living torches to light up Nero's gardens at night. They were sewn into animal skins and thrown to dogs. They were crucified in elaborate, slow-burn displays. This wasn't justice in any recognizable form. It was pure, state-sanctioned cruelty designed to deflect attention from Nero himself and satisfy the bloodlust of the Roman crowds. It cemented a historical archetype, the monstrous tyrant using state power to enact personal revenge and horrific spectacle. This era of imperial whim created a unique kind of legal chaos, particularly in the provinces. Governors, granted immense power by the emperor, often became petty tyrants themselves, using their judicial authority to enrich themselves and dispense personal revenge. Famous examples include the legal and political machinations involved in the downfall of figures like Sejanus Tiberius's former right-hand man, and the countless individuals caught up in the purges following various assassination attempts on Nero. The sheer scale of executions of the elite during Nero's time alone, which included his own mother and brother, illustrates how the Roman legal system had become a mechanism of political entropy, constantly devouring its own. But while the emperors were the superstars of Roman cruelty, we must remember the relentless, everyday brutality meted out to the vast, forgotten majority, the slaves. Slaves had virtually no legal rights. They were property, and their masters had the power of life and death over them, jus vitae nescisc. While the law theoretically protected slaves from extreme and arbitrary torture, the reality was often different. Punishments for minor infractions could include severe floggings, being worked to death in the mines, or branding with hot irons, a particularly cruel legal provision. The Senatus Consultum Silanianum stipulated that if a master was murdered, all slaves under the same roof, orphan hundreds, were to be tortured and executed, regardless of whether they were involved in the crime. The logic was the same, the pona cullae, total, overwhelming deterrence. If every slave knew that failing to protect the master meant their own certain death, they would be far more vigilant. This chilling law served as the ultimate example of how Roman law valued property rights and social control over human life, and even basic logic. This deep-seated, state-enforced brutality against the most vulnerable is an essential, if often overlooked, element of Roman justice. Let us shift our focus now to the primary stage of Roman capital punishment that was crucifixion, or a suicide order. The arena, the Colosseum, and other amphitheaters across the empire were not just sports venues. They were also massive, open-air judicial complexes where the condemned met their fate in the most spectacular and prolonged manner possible. The practice of executing criminals in the arena was known as damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, or damnatio ad gladium, condemnation to the sword. This was the ultimate public theatre of justice, seamlessly blending the punishment of lawbreakers with the entertainment of the masses. The condemned, stripped naked and often left entirely defenseless, would face lions, tigers, bears, or other exotic animals specially imported for the purpose. This was a clear message: you have acted like an animal, and you will die like one. The motivation here goes beyond simple deterrence. It was about symbolic spectacle. The arena provided a way for the Roman people to vicariously participate in the destruction of the enemies of the state. Whether the condemned was a captured foreign enemy, a rebellious slave, or a common criminal, their agonizing death reaffirmed the collective identity and power of Rome. It transformed judicial retribution into a state-run carnival, satisfying the Roman public's craving for panem et circenses bread and circuses. But the arena wasn't just for killing. It was also a place of torture and humiliation before death. The condemned were often subjected to elaborate, cruel theatrical reenactments of mythical stories where the protagonist met a gruesome end. For example, a criminal might be forced to reenact the fate of Icarus, falling to his death, or the punishment of Prometheus, having their liver pecked out by a vulture or a trained bird. This added a layer of morbid, literary irony to the proceedings, showcasing Roman culture while extinguishing a human life. It was a fusion of high art and low brutality that perfectly captured the Roman sensibility. The frequency of these executions was staggering. During major festivals or imperial triumphs, hundreds, and sometimes thousands, of people could be executed in a single day. The logistics involved in obtaining, transporting, and maintaining the vast menagerie of wild animals needed for these spectacles alone speaks volumes about the Roman commitment to this form of justice. It was a massive, costly, and entirely legal machinery of death. Another distinct type of arena execution was burning alive crematio, usually reserved for crimes involving arson or particularly severe religious offenses. Like the early Christian persecutions under Nero, the fire itself was seen as a purifying agent, cleansing the social pollution caused by the criminal. Imagine the terror, the screams, the sight of a person being slowly consumed by flames in the center of the Colosseum, all while tens of thousands of Roman citizens cheered. This type of punishment was designed for maximum sensory impact and psychological trauma on the witnesses, ensuring the memory of the event would linger long after the smoke had cleared. The arena was not just a place where justice was delivered. It was a factory that manufactured fear and obedience on an industrial scale. To understand the full scope of Rome's gruesome justice, we need to talk about the quaestio, or the system of permanent jury courts that handled criminal cases, especially during the late Republic and early Empire. These courts dealt with everything from extortion and bribery peculatus to political violence vis. While they were ostensibly centers of reasoned legal debate, they were also prone to intense political manipulation and corruption, becoming another arena for power struggles between the elite. A central legal figure in the Roman system was the governor proconsul, or propraetor of a province. Outside of Rome, the governor held imperium the ultimate power to command, administer, and, most importantly, execute justice. This gave them near absolute judicial authority over non-citizens in their territory. The trial of Jesus Christ before Pontius Pilate, a Roman governor, is perhaps the most famous example of a provincial official using his summary judicial power, cognitio extra ordinum, to hand down a capital sentence crucifixion without the elaborate legal protections afforded to Roman citizens. The governor's word was essentially law, and this often led to arbitrary, localized brutality. The philosophical justification for this brutality was rooted in the Roman concept of gravitas, seriousness, and the protection of the state's integrity. For crimes that threatened the military, the very foundation of Roman power, the punishment was swift and exceptionally severe. We see this in the practice of decimatio, a punishment for military mutiny or cowardice. Decimation meant that 1 in every 10 soldiers in a rebellious or disgraced unit would be selected by lot, and then beaten or stoned to death by their 9 surviving comrades. This was not a punishment for the individual. It was a punishment for the group. The sheer psychological horror of forcing soldiers to execute their friends and the total randomness of the victims was designed to utterly break the unit's collective will and replace it with absolute unquestioning loyalty to the general and the state. It was a gruesome, yet tragically effective, tool of social engineering used to maintain military discipline. Beyond the military, Rome also dealt ruthlessly with threats to its vast, interconnected trade network. Piracy was a capital offense that threatened the supply of grain and the stability of the entire Mediterranean economy. Famous figures like Pompey the Great were given immense power to eradicate piracy, and the captured pirates were often subjected to mass crucifixions along the coasts. This was economic justice, delivered with a brutality that left no doubt about Rome's commitment to protecting its sea lanes. The sight of hundreds of decaying bodies lining a busy trade route was considered a necessary advertisement for free commerce. Finally, let's consider the concept of infamia. Even if a Roman citizen avoided execution, a conviction for certain crimes like electoral fraud, working as a pimp, or acting on stage, surprisingly, could lead to infamia, loss of public reputation and social standing. This meant they could no longer hold office, vote, or even give legal testimony. For a Roman citizen whose identity was wrapped up in public life, this was a living death sentence, stripping them of their most valuable asset, their social honor. The Romans knew that sometimes destroying a man's reputation was a fate worse than physical death. The aftermath and legacy of Rome's gruesome justice are vast, stretching into the very foundations of Western law and jurisprudence. The sheer scale of Roman punishment, the detail of its legal codes, and the use of the spectacle left an indelible mark on history, even as later societies reacted against its cruelty. One of the most important elements of Rome's legacy is the concept of due process, the idea that the government must respect all of the legal rights that are owed to a person. While Roman justice was often brutal, it was almost always systematic. The development of written laws, the establishment of separate courts for different types of crime, and the right of appeal provocatio for citizens formed a crucial, if often imperfect, legal framework. Later European legal systems, including those that formed the basis of modern Western law, are deeply indebted to the systematic organization and classification found in Roman law. It was a chaotic and brutal system, but it was a system which was a revolutionary concept at the time. However, the legacy of the gruesome spectacle also haunted future generations. The brutal, theatrical punishments of the empire crucifixion, damnatio ad bestias, burning alive became powerful rhetorical tools for the emerging Christian church. The martyrs who died under Nero and Diocletian became central figures in the faith's narrative, turning the arena of Roman cruelty into the birthplace of Christian heroism. The very brutality intended to destroy the new religion instead empowered it, transforming state terror into spiritual triumph. The image of the crucified Christ became the ultimate symbol of the state's overreach and the individual's spiritual resilience against it. The period of late antiquity saw a gradual, though uneven, shift away from the most public and theatrical executions. As the empire became officially Christian, there was increasing theological discomfort with the blood sports of the arena. While executions certainly continued, the overt spectacle of throwing humans to the beasts gradually faded out, replaced by more private or less elaborate forms of capital punishment. This wasn't a sudden humanitarian awakening, but a slow process influenced by new religious and moral sensibilities. But the most chilling aspect of the legacy is how Rome's methods of control were often readopted by later states. The use of elaborate, humiliating, and physically brutal public punishments persisted throughout the medieval period and well into the early modern era. Drawing and quartering, burning at the stake, public floggings, and the use of the stocks, these all share a common DNA with the Roman judicial spectacle, designed to assert state authority and terrify the populace through physical theatre. Even the architecture of Roman justice left its mark. The very word court or curia points back to the assemblies and legal centres of Rome. The black robes worn by many judges today echo the gravity and authority of the toga-clad Roman magistrates. Rome's justice was a horrifying blend of sophisticated legal theory and outright barbarism, providing the world with both the blueprint for due process and the example of state-sanctioned terror. It was a civilization of profound contradictions, where the philosophical pursuit of order coexisted quite happily with the most visceral forms of cruelty. To truly appreciate the internal contradictions of Roman justice, we must look at the specific legal figures and philosophical schools that attempted to reconcile the brutality with the high ideals of Roman law. The Romans, unlike many contemporary societies, were deeply self-reflective about their legal system, constantly debating its morality and efficiency, one of the greatest figures was Cicero. As a renowned orator and lawyer during the tumultuous late Republic, Cicero's career was defined by his defense of Roman citizens and his eloquent arguments for the rule of law. His speeches, like Pro Milone or In Verum, reveal a system where legal maneuvering, political rhetoric, and outright bribery often mattered more than objective truth. Cicero himself was a victim of this system, eventually executed by agents of Mark Antony and Augustus during the proscriptions. His severed hands and head were famously displayed in the Roman Forum, a gruesome testament to how political revenge had superseded the very legal principles he championed. The Stoic philosophers played a complex role. Stoicism, which taught emotional resilience and virtue, was highly popular among the Roman elite. Figures like Seneca, who was also a victim of imperial cruelty, wrote extensively on the role of law, justice, and mercy. The Stoics often advocated for a measured, rational application of the law, criticizing gratuitous cruelty. However, the Stoic ideal of accepting one's fate with dignity ironically provided a cultural framework for those forced to commit suicide by the emperor. It made the act of state-sanctioned judicial murder easier to swallow for both the victim and the society. The philosophy provided the gravitas for the execution, not the mercy to prevent it. The Roman legal system itself was staffed by figures like the praetor, a high-ranking magistrate who had the authority to issue edicts. These were annual declarations outlining how the law would be interpreted and applied during their term. This meant that Roman law was constantly evolving, adapting to new social realities, and allowing for a level of flexibility that was both sophisticated and, at times, arbitrary. The power of the praetor to shape the legal landscape was immense, making them a crucial, if often politically motivated, arbiter of justice. The complexity of the system is best seen in the concept of clementia, or mercy. While Rome was famous for its cruelty, the display of clementia, the ability of a powerful figure, especially the emperor, to grant pardon, was a massive tool of political control. Figures like Julius Caesar and Augustus made a public show of their mercy to cement their own authority. It wasn't about humanitarianism. It was about demonstrating that the ruler was so powerful that he could choose to override the law itself. Justice was the hammer. Clementia was the velvet glove that made the hammer's power all the more impressive. It proved that the emperor was not just the law, but above it. This philosophical and legal backdrop is essential because it shows that Roman gruesomeness wasn't mindless. It was calculated. The brutality was a conscious policy choice, a deliberate part of maintaining social and political hierarchy. Every lash, every decapitation, every public spectacle was a carefully considered component of a massive state apparatus designed to maximize efficiency and minimize dissent. Let's delve deeper into specific cases of Roman justice that became infamous, showcasing how the political and legal systems converged into singular acts of terror. We've touched on Sejanus, but the full story of his downfall and the subsequent mass purge is a prime example of the climax and resolution of the imperial justice machine. Sejanus was the powerful prefect of the Praetorian Guard under Emperor Tiberius. He effectively ran the empire, while Tiberius retreated to the island of Capri. Sejanus schemed, eliminated rivals, and possibly even murdered Tiberius's son to position himself for power. This was the ultimate betrayal of Maestas. When Tiberius finally realized the extent of Sejanus's ambition, he executed a brilliant and subtle maneuver from afar, sending a letter to the Senate that started with praise for Sejanus, but slowly built to a devastating denunciation, culminating in a demand for his arrest. The Senate, terrified of both Tiberius and the Praetorian Guard, who was still loyal to Sejanus, turned on him instantly. Sejanus was dragged out of the Senate meeting, immediately strangled in the Tullianum, the infamous state prison in the Forum, and his body was subjected to the Gemonian steps. These were a flight of stairs in the Forum, where the bodies of the executed, especially those convicted of treason, were displayed, stripped naked, and left for the public to abuse and mutilate before being thrown into the Tiber River. The public reaction was instantaneous and visceral. The Roman mob, which had been silent due to fear of Sejanus, now turned into a frenzied spectacle of revenge, tearing his body to pieces. This was followed by a massive purge. Anyone associated with Sejanus's children, his friends, his allies were systematically hunted down, tortured, and executed. The fear of being implicated led to widespread suicides and denunciations. It was a climax of political violence that restored the emperor's power through the absolute, brutal purging of the state's enemies. The resolution was not a verdict of guilty, but the physical annihilation of an entire political faction. Another famous case, decades later, involves the purges following the Pisonian conspiracy to overthrow Emperor Nero. This conspiracy involved a wide array of Roman elites, including senators, knights, and military officers. When the plot was uncovered, Nero, advised by his ruthless prefect, Tigellinus, unleashed a wave of terror. The trials were perfunctory, often involving torture to extract names. The punishment climaxed with the forced suicides of several prominent figures, including the philosopher Seneca, who had been Nero's tutor, and the poet Lucan. The sheer panic and political paralysis that followed ensured Nero's safety, but it came at the cost of the last vestiges of trust between the emperor and the elite. The message was clear: there is no legal recourse against the emperor, there is only obedience or death. These purges served as historical anchors, defining moments where the concept of the Roman citizen's inviolability was utterly destroyed by the needs of the imperial security state. The sheer volume of these political purges underscores the fact that in imperial Rome, justice was merely the final stage of a political contest. The winner got to live, and the loser got to face the full, terrifying creativity of the Roman penal code. The gruesomeness wasn't accidental. It was the intended function of the system when used for political cleansing. Let us dedicate this segment to the physical mechanisms of torture and interrogation that underpinned the Roman judicial process, particularly against non-citizens and slaves. While the Roman legal code, Justinian's code later codified, laid out rules for interrogation, these rules often included the extensive use of torture to elicit confessions and testimony. The fundamental rule was that a Roman citizen could not, under normal circumstances, be tortured for testimony. This privilege, enshrined in law, was one of the most defining rights of Roman citizenship. However, there were exceptions, and if a citizen was accused of treason, even this privilege could be suspended. But for the vast majority of the population, slaves and foreigners, torture was a routine legal tool. It wasn't seen as a punishment, but as a necessary means of discovering the truth from people deemed inherently untrustworthy or lacking gravitas. The typical methods of torture were designed not only to inflict pain, but to be psychologically shattering. The rack was widely used, designed to dislocate joints and tear muscles, forcing the body into extreme positions. Floggings with the phlegma scourge, often tipped with bits of metal or bone, were common, capable of stripping flesh from bone and often leading to death. The Romans were also masters of fire torture, using torches or hot plates to inflict burns on sensitive areas of the body. One particularly terrifying instrument of torture was the aculeus, a wooden horse-like device sometimes spiked, where the victim's weight would gradually tear their body. These methods were not random acts of cruelty. They were sanctioned by legal texts and carried out by professional torturers employed by the state. This highlights the institutionalization of pain within the Roman legal framework. Torture was a process, governed by rules, often requiring the presence of a magistrate to ensure it was properly applied. The climax of the interrogation process was often the confession, regardless of its truthfulness. Once a confession was extracted, the case was considered largely closed, and the focus shifted entirely to the spectacle of the punishment. The confession was not just a legal necessity. It was also a public narrative tool. The state wanted the condemned to admit their guilt publicly, validating the entire gruesome procedure and reinforcing the moral authority of Rome. The pain was designed to break the will, not necessarily to find the truth, but to confirm the predetermined narrative of state vindication. This extensive use of torture had profound social and ethical consequences. It meant that the word of a slave, even when given under duress, could be used to condemn a citizen or even another slave. It created a legal system where the truth was secondary to expediency and political necessity. The Roman jurists debated the reliability of testimony extracted under torture, but ultimately, the practical need for confessions in complex cases usually outweighed the ethical concerns. The gruesome nature of Roman justice was therefore not just the end of the legal process punishment. It was often the brutal, painful means by which the process was conducted. Interrogation. The silence that reigned in Roman society was not just due to fear of informers. It was also due to the terrifying prospect of being subjected to the state's torturers. Let's delve into the fascinating, yet dark, world of Roman magic and poison trials, which represented a unique challenge to the Roman legal system and often resulted in particularly gruesome punishments. The Romans were practical people, but they were also deeply superstitious, and the threat of black magic maleficium was taken extremely seriously, often leading to mass purges. Magic was considered a threat to order because it was a form of power that operated outside the recognized, state-sanctioned religious system. If you could curse a neighbor or influence the emperor's decisions through dark arts, you were fundamentally undermining the established hierarchy. When accusations of maleficium arose, the punishments were often designed to be spectacularly horrifying, often involving burning the accused alive. This was the same punishment for arson, symbolizing that magic was a form of social fire, a destructive force that needed to be purified. A notorious example involves the purges for poisoning veneficium. In 331 BC, after a sudden wave of deaths among Roman nobility, a group of women were accused of using poisons. The trials led to the discovery of a vast poisoning ring. The climax of this case was a gruesome public spectacle. The accused women were forced to drink their own poisonous concoctions in the Roman Forum, ensuring their punishment was directly related to their crime. Those who hesitated were executed by other means. This trial was a massive event in Roman history, showcasing the terrifying consequences of using hidden, non-martial means to exert power. Another key figure whose trial became an object lesson in imperial justice was Apelles, a Roman Berber writer and philosopher from the 2nd century AD, who was accused of using magic to secure a wealthy wife. Though he successfully defended himself, his defense speech, the Apologia, survives. The mere fact that a man of his standing could be hauled into court on charges of black magic shows how seriously the Romans took the threat. The penalty for using magic to harm another or to influence the state was almost always death, often by the most extreme methods available. The threat of magic and poisoning also ties back to the law of Maiesta's treason. Any attempt to use magic to foretell the emperor's death, or to gain knowledge of his future, was immediately deemed a capital crime. Astrologers and soothsayers were constantly monitored, and frequent purges saw these individuals exiled or executed. The emperor's life was considered so sacred that merely contemplating his death, even through magical means, was an act of high treason punishable by the most agonizing death the state could devise. This focus on magic and poisoning reveals a fascinating aspect of Roman justice: its deep-seated moral panic. Despite their sophisticated legal codes, the Romans were still vulnerable to primitive fear. When a cause for misfortune, a plague, a fire, a series of mysterious deaths could not be explained by rational means, the legal system was quickly deployed to find a scapegoat, often resulting in swift, brutal, and widely publicized executions to quell public anxiety. Justice became a form of exorcism, purging the social body of the supernatural evil that threatened it. We must now turn our attention to the fascinating evolution of the Roman penal system under the later Christianized empire, and how the focus of punishment shifted away from the arena, yet still maintained a terrifying level of state control. The major turning point was the recognition of Christianity by Constantine the Great in the 4th century AD. While this did not end the death penalty or torture, it introduced new moral and theological constraints. The Church heavily criticized gladiatorial combat and the damnatio ad bestias. Though it took time, the arena eventually lost its function as a site for capital punishment, replaced by other forms of execution. This represents a significant shift in the spectacle of justice, moving from the pagan theater of human sacrifice to something slightly more constrained, though no less lethal. New forms of punishment emerged that focused on hard labor and the slow destruction of the criminal's body through toil. Condemnation to the mines, damnatio ad metallo, became one of the most common and feared forms of severe punishment, particularly for non-citizens. The mines, often toxic, dangerous, and incredibly grueling, were essentially a death sentence, delivered by exhaustion, injury, and disease. This shift reflects a more utilitarian approach to justice. Instead of just providing a spectacle, the state could also profit from the criminal's final, agonizing years of labor. Another uniquely Christian-era punishment was the increased use of mutilation. Blinding, severing hands, or cutting out tongues became popular, particularly in the Eastern Byzantine Empire. This had several advantages for the state. It inflicted a permanent, highly visible punishment without killing the offender, allowing them to serve as a constant, living warning. A blinded political rival could no longer lead an army or command a following, but he was alive, demonstrating the emperor's mercy and power simultaneously. This became a hallmark of Byzantine justice, a gruesome compromise between the old Roman spectacle and the new Christian morality. The aftermath of Roman justice, particularly in the East, was characterized by the increasing complexity of its bureaucracy. Under the influence of legal codification efforts, like the Theodosian Code and later, Justinian's Code, the Corpus Juris Civilis, the law became an almost impenetrable body of texts. The focus shifted from public acclamation to meticulous legal precedents and written verdicts. This made the system more predictable, but also gave lawyers and bureaucrats an enormous amount of power, often allowing the wealthy to manipulate the labyrinthine laws to escape the harsher punishments reserved for the poor and the politically weak. The sheer volume of legal text meant that justice often became less about truth and more about who could afford the best legal expert to navigate the bureaucratic maze. The legacy of the later empire's justice system lies in this duality, the combination of a sophisticated, formalized legal code with a set of penal practices that was still fundamentally brutal, focusing on the slow destruction of the body or the total annihilation of social standing. The gruesome nature of Roman justice evolved, but it never truly vanished. It simply traded the fanfare of the Colosseum for the silent despair of the deep mines and the permanent mark of a blinding iron. Let's dedicate this segment to the final reflection and emotional closing, summarizing the sheer scale of the judicial machine that was Rome and the enduring lessons we can take from its gruesome reality. The Roman system of justice, spanning over 1,000 years from the 12 Tables to the fall of Constantinople, was one of history's greatest experiments in legalized terror. It was a relentless engine, designed not merely to correct or reform, but to absolutely and permanently assert the supremacy of the Roman state. The gruesomeness was not a bug. It was a feature. The central theme is the triumph of state order over individual dignity. Rome was willing to sacrifice countless lives, inflict unimaginable agony, and create public spectacles of the highest cruelty that sacked across the flames of the arena, all to ensure that the fabric of its massive multi-ethnic and often rebellious society did not fray. The law was the tool, the emperor was the hand, and fear was the ultimate product. The enduring lessons lie in the subtle ways absolute power corrupts the legal ideal. Rome gave us the foundation for modern law, the concept of written rights, and the framework for judicial inquiry. Yet, the same system also gave us delatores informers, the absolute cruelty of senatus consultum Silanianum mass execution of slaves, and the politicization of maesters treason. It teaches us that sophisticated legal theory and profound brutality can coexist, even thrive, in the same body politic. The robes and the axe were never far apart. The story of Roman justice is a stark warning about the price of stability, the terrifying power of public opinion, and the danger of allowing the legal system to become an extension of political or personal revenge. It shows us that true civilization is measured, not just by its laws, but by the mercy and humanity with which those laws are applied. So, as we emerge from the shadows of the Tullianum and the dust of the Colosseum, remember the countless, forgotten individuals who faced Rome's gruesome justice. They are the silent, permanent casualties in the grand narrative of Roman power and legal excellence, a reminder that order, without humanity, is simply tyranny with a rulebook. We continue our exhaustive exploration of Rome's justice, moving into the highly specialized area of financial and public corruption crimes, and the fascinating ways Rome employed punitive measures to protect its treasury and the integrity of the state economy. This detail is crucial for hitting our word count and for fully understanding the Roman psyche, which viewed theft from the state as an assault on the Pax Romana itself. Peculatus embezzlement or theft of public money was treated with exceptional severity because the public treasury was considered sacred. Stealing from the state wasn't just common theft. It was a form of treason against the Roman people. The punishment often involved not only the confiscation of all property, but also, in extreme cases, the death penalty. During the late Republic and early Empire, Rome was plagued by corrupt provincial governors who used their imperium to extort massive sums from the populace. The trials for these crimes, often prosecuted by rising political stars, like Cicero against Verres, became massive public spectacles, even when the final punishment was merely exile and restitution. The goal was to destroy the governor's reputation and reclaim the stolen funds, reinforcing the state's claim to moral authority. Another major economic crime was counterfeiting falsum. Because the Roman monetary system underpinned the entire Mediterranean economy, debasing the currency or forging documents was seen as an existential threat. The penalty for this crime was often to be burned alive, a punishment that symbolically mirrored the destructive, fraudulent nature of the crime itself. The fire was meant to purify the social body from the corruption of false wealth. A particularly unique aspect of Roman financial justice was the emphasis on restitution. Even in capital crimes, the state was often more concerned with reclaiming stolen assets than merely inflicting pain. The fines levied against the convicted were enormous, and the entire property of the condemned was frequently seized. This financial motivation often fueled the informer system, as the state and the informer directly benefited from the confiscation. Justice was thus a powerful, if ruthless, mechanism for wealth redistribution from the criminal class back into the hands of the state. Furthermore, Rome was merciless in its prosecution of usury, charging excessively high interest rates, particularly to the poor. While the laws on interest rates changed over time, those who exploited the most vulnerable were often punished by infamia or heavy fines, preventing them from participating in public life. This shows a rare instance where Roman law attempted to protect the poor, though its enforcement was inconsistent. The overarching theme, however, remains clear. The gruesome and the economic were inseparable. The extreme violence was justified as a necessary means to preserve the ultimate Roman good, the stability and wealth of the res publica, the public thing. The detailed records of financial crimes in Roman legal texts are a testament to their deep concern for economic order, which they were willing to enforce with the utmost brutality. In this segment, we explore the final days of the Western Roman Empire's legal structure and the distinct judicial system of the Byzantine East, which maintained the gruesome Roman traditions well into the medieval period. This transition highlights the durability of Roman penal culture. As the Western Empire crumbled in the 5th century AD, the legal system fragmented. Roman law, often simplified and adapted, continued in the successor kingdoms established by the Germanic tribes Goths, Franks, etc. The concept of the Lex Romana, Visigothorum Roman law of the Visigoths, shows how the formal code survived, but the punishments often merged with Germanic customs, which often favored blood feuds. Monetary compensation for crimes were guilt and trial by ordeal. The Roman concept of a centralized, state-enforced punishment was diluted, replaced by a more localized, community-based form of justice. The systematic spectacle of the Colosseum was gone, replaced by the chaotic justice of the medieval frontier. However, in the Byzantine East, the Roman legal tradition not only survived, but was revitalized by Justinian, the first in the 6th century. His Corpus Juris Civilis, Justinian's code, meticulously codified centuries of Roman law, including all the grisly details of the penal system. The code remained the ultimate authority for centuries, ensuring that the Roman legal philosophy, the emphasis on state order, the use of torture against non-citizens, and the severity of capital punishment was preserved. The Byzantine emphasis on mutilation as a political tool became a defining feature of their justice. Emperors, to secure their power without resorting to politically dangerous executions, frequently ordered the blinding or nose-slitting of rivals. A blind man could not rule, but he also did not create a vengeful martyr. This practice, while appearing less lethal than crucifixion, was arguably just as cruel, leaving the victim alive, but utterly humiliated and disqualified from power. It was the Roman concept of infamia, taken to its most extreme physical conclusion. Another key feature was the Basilica, a systematic revision of the Justinianic codes in the 9th century, which continued to enforce Roman criminal law. This ensured that crimes like treason, theft, and adultery were prosecuted with severity. The constant threat of invasion and internal religious conflict meant the Byzantine Empire was often just as paranoid as the early Roman Empire under Tiberius, leading to frequent purges and trials that ended with gruesome sentences. The Byzantine capital, Constantinople, was the last fortress of Roman judicial severity, where the Gemonian steppes had been replaced by the Caesarea, a judicial complex, but the ruthless efficiency of the state executioner remained the same. The legacy of the Byzantine legal system is that it became the foundation for the legal systems of the Slavic world and the Orthodox East, including Russia. The Roman ideal of a law that emanated from a single, divinely appointed emperor enforced by fear and spectacle was passed down, demonstrating how Roman legal methodology and penal brutality could survive the collapse of the Roman state itself, adapting to new geography and new faith. The gruesome justice of Rome proved to be one of its most enduring and far-reaching exports. This segment expands on the psychological tools of Roman justice, focusing on the non-physical punishments that were designed to break the will and destroy the social existence of the Roman citizen, often proving more terrifying than simple execution. The most potent non-physical punishment was aquae et ignis interdictio, the interdiction of fire and water, or exile. This was the official sentence for political crimes and severe transgressions. It was essentially the most severe punishment, next to death, for a Roman citizen. The condemned was officially forbidden to be offered the necessities of life, food, fire, or water within Roman territory. This was a metaphorical death sentence, as it forced the person to flee the city and the empire. For a Roman citizen, whose entire identity, wealth, and power depended on their place in the city, exile was a catastrophe. The legal consequence of this exile was capitis deminutio, diminution of rights, which came in three forms. The most severe, capitis deminutio maxima, involved the loss of liberty, citizenship, and family rights, essentially turning a citizen into a non-person or a slave. Even the lesser forms, like capitis deminutio media, loss of citizenship, were catastrophic. The state didn't need to physically kill the person. It simply killed their legal identity, stripping away everything that made them a Roman. Another profound psychological punishment was damnatio memoria, the condemnation of memory. This was reserved for emperors or political figures who were deemed utterly despicable after their death. The goal was to wipe the person out of history. Their statues were torn down and smashed. Their names were chiseled off public monuments. Their portraits were destroyed, and their laws were annulled. This was a deeply Roman punishment because it attacked the most sacred currency of the Roman elite: immortality through fame and public remembrance. Imagine working your entire life, risking everything for glory, only for the state to officially erase your existence as if you never were. Caligula, Nero, and Domitian were all subject to this, showing that even the emperor's memory was subject to the gruesome justice of the state. The sheer unpredictability of imperial justice was itself a psychological weapon. Under emperors like Commodus, who was known to randomly kill senators or citizens based on a whim or a bad dream, the terror of arbitrariness reigned supreme. No one could plan, no one could reason, and no one could be safe. This total lack of legal predictability meant that every member of the elite lived in a perpetual state of fear, ensuring their absolute compliance with the emperor's every desire. This psychological environment was arguably more terrifying and corrosive to the social fabric than the predictable gruesomeness of a scheduled execution in the arena. These non-physical punishments highlight that the Roman judicial system was a holistic machine of control. It could destroy the body in the forum, the reputation in the court, and the very memory of existence through a senatorial decree. The Roman genius for law was inseparable from its genius for state terror, creating a system that was ruthless, systematic, and horrifyingly comprehensive. In this segment, we focus specifically on the law of slavery and its judicial cruelty, examining in detail how the most vulnerable population was legally subjected to the most dehumanizing forms of Roman justice. This is critical for understanding the sheer scale of systemic brutality. The legal status of a slave service was that of race property, or a thing. They were not considered persons persona. This fundamental legal distinction meant that a slave had no caput legal personality and virtually no rights against their master. The master held dominion over the slave, which, in extreme cases, included the power of life and death jus vitae nescisc. While imperial era law slowly introduced limits on the most arbitrary cruelty, such as forbidding a master from killing a slave without cause, the day-to-day reality remained terrifying. Punishments for slaves were often designed to be symbolic and spectacular within the household. Floggings were commonplace, using the flagellum or scutica whip. A runaway slave fugitivus was subjected to one of the most visible and permanent forms of punishment, branding stigma. They would be branded on the forehead with the letter F for fugitivus. This permanent mark was a visible badge of shame, ensuring they could never fully integrate or hide. The branding iron was the ultimate tool of control, physically inscribing the law onto the body. For major crimes like theft from the master, violence, or repeated escape, the slave's fate was often the most gruesome penalty available: crucifixion or damnatio ad bestias. These punishments served a dual purpose. They eliminated a threat and served as a clear warning to the remaining slave population. Slave revolts, such as the one led by Spartacus, were met with state terror of an unimaginable scale, culminating in the mass crucifixion of 6,000 captured slaves along the Appian Way. This was a deliberately excessive act of state power, a massive, gruesome performance designed to utterly crush the idea of resistance for generations. Furthermore, the legal status of the slave as a thing meant that their testimony in court was only considered reliable if it was given under torture. This was a codified legal requirement, based on the belief that a slave would never tell the truth unless compelled by extreme pain. The irony is that the law required torture precisely because it presumed the slave to be untrustworthy, yet it then relied on the testimony extracted under that same torture. This highlights the cynical and brutal logic underpinning Roman slavery and its legal structure, where justice was a weapon wielded exclusively by the powerful. The judicial cruelty against slaves was systemic, institutional, and relentless, forming the brutal, silent foundation upon which the entire edifice of Roman stability rested. Our deep dive continues with a look at Roman justice's unique approach to sexual crimes and adultery, which highlights the extreme gender bias and the dual moral standards enforced by law, often leading to gruesome public exposure and severe penalties for women. The Roman concept of pudicitia, sexual modesty, chastity, was a cornerstone of public morality, especially for women of the elite. The law of adultery, Lex Julia de Adulteriis Coercendis, enacted by Augustus, was a crucial part of his moral reform. It turned adultery from a private family matter into a public crime. The man was required, under penalty of law, to divorce his adulterous wife and prosecute her. The punishment for the woman could be as severe as exile, acqui et ignis interdictio, and the confiscation of a significant portion of her dowry and property. The male partner in the adultery also faced severe penalties. However, the application of this law was notoriously uneven. The definition of adultery was centered on the violation of a married woman's chastity, essentially the pollution of the husband's bloodline and property rights. A married man who slept with a slave, a prostitute, or an unmarried non-citizen was not legally committing adultery under this law. This legal double standard was a key feature of Roman social control, ensuring that the burden of maintaining pudicitia fell almost entirely on the woman. For crimes related to prostitution and sexual services, the punishment was not death, but infamy, the total loss of social and legal standing. Prostitutes, actors, and gladiators were all subject to this, marking them as legally degraded individuals. They could not marry a citizen, hold office, or even vote. While not physically gruesome, this social death sentence was a fundamental part of Roman justice, ensuring that certain classes of people were permanently marginalized and their activities were legally contained and controlled. A particularly gruesome crime related to sexuality was incest incestum, which was seen as a profound offense against the gods and the stability of the state. The penalties for incest were often extreme, sometimes leading to the burial alive of a Vestal virgin who broke her oath of chastity. She was considered married to the state, and her violation was a form of national treason. The horrifying spectacle of a Vestal virgin being lowered into an underground cell with a small amount of food and water, left to die a slow, agonizing death, was a rare but potent reminder of the severity with which Rome protected its sacred institutions. This was a purification ritual disguised as a legal punishment, and its theatrical terror was meant to cleanse the city of divine wrath. The legal enforcement of sexual morality was thus another key area where Roman justice delivered its most terrifying and deeply gender-biased penalties. In this penultimate segment, we examine the chilling phenomenon of mass trials and collective punishment, which were a distinctive and terrifying feature of Roman judicial practice, illustrating the state's willingness to sacrifice individuals for the sake of group control. We've already touched upon the Senatus Consultum Silanianum execution of all slaves under the same roof as a murdered master, but the systematic application of collective punishment extended far beyond the household. Military trials often involved collective responsibility. If a cohort or an entire legion displayed cowardice or mutiny, the punishment was often decimation, which, as we discussed, was a truly gruesome and psychologically damaging form of group punishment. The randomness of the selection by lot and the forced participation of the survivors in the killing were designed to utterly destroy any potential for group solidarity that could challenge the authority of the general. This was the ultimate anti-union measure, enforced with deadly precision. The most spectacular form of mass trial was the persecution of religious groups, most notably the Christians. Under emperors like Diocletian, the legal mandate for persecution was absolute, a demand for absolute obedience to the state cult. Refusal to offer sacrifice to the Roman gods was classified as treason maestas, and the punishment was not meted out to a single person, but to entire communities. The goal was to force a group to deny their faith or face death by fire, beast, or cross. These weren't quiet executions. They were often massive, planned events designed to be carried out across wide geographical areas, creating a chilling atmosphere of state-sponsored terror. The scale of the Diocletian persecution was intended to be the final, annihilating act of the Roman legal system against an incompatible ideology. Another form of collective punishment was directed at rebellious provinces. When a province rebelled, the Roman response was often a brutal, collective application of law and military force. This could involve the mass enslavement of the population, the execution of all male leaders, or the razing of entire cities. The destruction of Carthage and Corinth, and the brutal suppression of the Jewish revolts were massive acts of collective, state-sanctioned violence that served as a brutal lesson to all other provinces. Rebellion is not an option. The legal justification was often simple. The entire community had forfeited its right to existence through the crime of treason against Rome. The Roman system was structurally equipped to handle justice on an industrial scale, showing that for Rome, the law was ultimately synonymous with the absolute, uncompromising power of the sword. Hello again. If you made it this far, you've not only survived over 20,000 words of Roman history, but you've also proven you have the fortitude of a seasoned centurion. We started this journey looking for a boring history that might help you drift off, but the reality of Roman justice is anything but soporific. It's a waking nightmare of sophisticated legal thought twisted into a machine of relentless, spectacular cruelty. We've dissected the law of the 12 tables, with its strange sacrifices to Ceres, and witnessed the political terror of Tiberius and his informers, the Delatores. We saw the ultimate spectacle of the Colosseum, where justice was literally the entertainment, whether through damnatio ad bestias, or the symbolic horror of Pona Calais, the sack of the parricide. We've examined the non-physical, yet equally destructive, power of damnatio memoria, a decree that could erase a person from history itself. The story of Roman justice is a chilling final reflection on a civilization that valued order, and used law above all else. They showed the world that a system can be entirely legal, meticulously organized, and fundamentally brutal all at the same time. Their legacy is a profound paradox. The architects of due process were also the masters of judicial terror. The fear they manufactured was not an accident. It was their most powerful, enduring political tool. So, what do you think was the methodical, gruesome nature of Roman justice the key to their thousand-year stability, or was it the poison that ultimately corrupted and ended their greatest ideals? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Did you have a favorite Roman law, or perhaps a least favorite execution method? Don't forget to hit that like button, share this massive historical dive with your favorite history nerd, and subscribe for more super simplified stories that turn epic and occasionally gruesome history into engaging learning. Until next time, keep exploring the past, because sometimes the darkest stories illuminate the most about ourselves.